Welcome to Preemptive Strike, the show where we look at the first hour of a JRPG to gauge the entertainment value of its opening act and gather statistical data to analyze the trends across different games. Join us as we journey through the rich history of JRPGs to see how their gameplay evolves and innovates from one game to the next. For each game, we'll examine how the first hour sets the tone for the rest of the journey, explore the ways in which the story and gameplay unfold to draw the player into the world and keep them coming back, as well as explain general tips, tricks, and trivia for a first-time player. Today, we'll discuss all of this and more on Preemptive Strike. Welcome to Episode 7 of Preemptive Strike, the show where we talk about all the things you need to know before starting up your retro RPG adventure. This week, we'll be talking about Final Fantasy III for the Famicom. Tyler, take it away with the general overview.
Alright, Final Fantasy III was originally released on the Famicom April 27th, 1990. Now, to put this date in perspective, the Super Famicom came out in Japan November 21st, 1990. So it's pretty late into the Famicom's lifespan. The US, we would not get Final Fantasy III for a very, very long time. So the first time we actually got any form of Final Fantasy III in the US was November 14th, 2006, being the DS remake. However, the DS remake is so, not different, but just the amount of changes and additions they added to it, a lot of people don't consider it the exact same as Final Fantasy III. So if you want to look for a pretty good one-to-one release of when Final Fantasy III first released in the US, that would actually be the Pixel remaster in July 28, 2021. So that is a 11,415 day gap. Easily the largest in the series of Preemptive Strike so far.
Yeah.
One day it will be beaten, though, if we ever cover Silver Ghost. So, no surprise here, but Final Fantasy III was developed by Squaresoft, by the same people that developed the other games, too. So, Hironobu Sakaguchi being the director and writer, Nasir Gabali still being the, main programmer. You got Yoshitaka Amano with the art. We got Nobuo Uematsu being the composer. And we didn't give this guy enough love before. We kind of forgot about him in earlier episodes, but we got Hiromichi Tanaka being the designer, but he's a part of the Final Fantasy team since the beginning, too.
Yeah, he's important for the development history, so I figured we should include him this time around.
So if you're a collector and you want to get your hands on the original release for the Famicom, if you want the loose cartridge, you can get it for about $6. And if you want complete in box, it's about $45. So if you're a big fan of the series, it'd be a nice thing to add to the collection for not too expensive. Sales-wise, in Japan, there's really not good numbers that we could actually report on. There is the VG sales wiki that lists 1.4 million, but it seems to be confused with Final Fantasy III in the US, which is actually Final Fantasy VI because of how they localized games. So Chad, can you go over some of the remakes and ports? I talked about a few of them, but give us an overview of the rest.
Right. So, Final Fantasy III is easily the black sheep of the, I guess you could say, the Nintendo sextet of Final Fantasy games. It's given the least amount of love in the terms of remakes and ports. It did receive a Wii, Wii U, and Nintendo 3DS Virtual Console release in Japan only. And it also showed up on the Famicom Classic, of all things. On the NES Classic in the US, we got Final Fantasy I instead of Final Fantasy III. There's the DS remake that you mentioned, which was also ported to iOS, Android, PSP, and Windows through Steam. But the DS remake is kind of its own thing. It seems like the wikis like to categorize that as something different. The true remake of Final Fantasy III came out, and the Pixel remaster came out just not too long ago. It's interesting that Final Fantasy III is the only one that did not receive a WonderSwan port. And because it didn't receive the WonderSwan port, it couldn't receive the GBA port later because those were based on the WonderSwan. And it also did not receive a PlayStation 1 port like the rest of the Final Fantasy games. Now, there's rumors online that talk about how they lost the source code or the source code was deleted or something along those lines, but I couldn't find any substantial evidence that backs that up, and I was kind of disappointed. I thought that it was true. That's what I had thought for all this time, but it seems like they didn't want to port Final Fantasy III based on something that Hiromichi Tanaka said. It would have been too difficult to port to the WonderSwan, so they just didn't. It was too difficult because of the large file size. Interestingly enough, just want to bring this up here, the file size for Final Fantasy III is one of the largest on the NES in general. It uses what's called the MMC3 macro chip, which can hold 512 kilobytes of program data and 256 kilobytes of graphical data. Now, of course, for today's standards, that's a drop in the bucket, but back then, that's huge. And you can definitely see that in the graphics of the games. We'll talk about that later, though. As far as how long it would take to beat the game, if you wanted to try it out for yourself, the original version of the game takes about 16 and a half hours to beat for the main story, 18 and a half hours for main plus extra, or 19 hours for the completionist. It reviewed pretty positively whenever it was released. In the Famitsu magazine, it received a 36 out of 40, and it was one of the magazine's highest rated games up until 1990, along with Dragon Quest II, Dragon Quest III, and Zelda 2: The Adventures of Link, which also received a 36 out of 40 in the magazine. Most review websites nowadays give the NES version, or maybe the Pixel Remaster Remake, an 8 out of 10, which isn't bad. It's a good game. Generally, it is considered a good game. It also received a manga adaptation a little bit later called Legend of the Eternal Wind, just to bank off of some of that success. And the Onion Knight is rather common in some of the future installments of the game, being referenced in little Easter eggs or things like that.
Yeah, for reference, the Onion Knight is just the basic class that your characters start out with. In like Final Fantasy V, which also uses classes similarly, the Onion Knight does not exist. Instead, it's a freelancer.
Yeah, right. Thanks for that context there, Tyler. Yeah, the Onion Knight is the base class of Final Fantasy III. The development history is interesting for Final Fantasy III because there was a shift in the location they had to work at about halfway through, because Nasir, the programmer of the game, his work visa expired and the entire development staff followed him to Sacramento, California. Again, this was about halfway through the game, so it's a miracle that this game even came out. With the release of the SNES on the horizon, Hiromichi Tanaka had to say that this was the first time that they had seen a new generation of consoles, and it was really difficult to predict what was going to happen. So they wanted to put all of their effort into Final Fantasy III, and you can definitely see that in the game. And one other piece of information that seems to be skipped in a lot of development history pages on the internet is that Sakaguchi's mother actually passed away during the development of the game, and it was rather tragically in a house fire. So Sakaguchi went through a major life-changing event as the game was being programmed, and he claims that he wanted to put more of a focus on the narrative of his games from that point forward. It's interesting because a lot of people seem to mix up the fact that Sakaguchi's mother died and the development of Final Fantasy VII, and that impacting the development of Final Fantasy VII, but that's not actually true. Aerith's death is not based off of this at all. So I find that interesting, though, because I don't find Final Fantasy III to have a very grand narrative. I think we see that more so in Final Fantasy IV, when that comes out in just about a year later after Final Fantasy III. And the last thing I want to talk about is the translation patch that Tyler and I both used for this game. It was put together by Alex W. Jackson, Neil Corlett, and SOM2 Freak. These guys are all pretty prolific in the translating community, and we're grateful that they could bring the NES game to a Western audience through their translation.
So moving on to go over a little bit of the manual, it's honestly kind of lackluster compared to some of the other manuals we've looked at so far. Of course, we don't have a US manual since it's never released in the West, and in the Japanese manual, a lot of what it goes over is just descriptions of the jobs that you could use or choose in the game. However, not all of the jobs are in the manual even, so like that's a letdown there, I'd even say. Of course, to be fair, there's tons of jobs in Final Fantasy III compared to other games like Dragon Quest III, for instance. Like, there's probably at least 3 times the amount of jobs in Final Fantasy III compared to Dragon Quest III. Okay, moving on to some gameplay mechanics that are new to Final Fantasy III compared to 2. So we're back to the original play style. Like, you actually level up. It's not like Final Fantasy II where your stats just increase based on the actions you do. Some new changes they added: whenever you fight and select an enemy to attack, an icon will actually appear above the enemy that show that it's getting attacked already. So you could use that for planning for what other characters are going to do. And the biggest thing for gameplay wise that Final Fantasy III is known for is the jobs. You can change your jobs on the fly. No need to reclass like in Dragon Quest III, like after getting to a certain level in a specific part of the game. Just pretty much at any point you want to switch jobs. And their dungeons are really based around you using jobs or switching out your jobs like constantly. Like there's tons of dungeons where they don't outright require you to, but they heavily suggest that you use certain jobs.
Yeah, I do want to say the biggest divergence between the 3D version and the original version is how they handle changing jobs. Because in the 3D version, the DS version, you take a hit to your stats and you get a debuff, essentially, for switching a job, which logistically makes sense. If you switch a job on the fly, you're going to be a little bit rusty on how you do that job. But in the NES version, you have to spend something called capacity points in order to change jobs, which are awarded after battles, so it's not too difficult to change jobs. But it's definitely the biggest divide, one of the biggest divides between the 3D version and the original.
Capacity points also do not make it into the Pixel remaster. So, for the most part, compared to the previous games, the status effects are the same. There are 2 new statuses that were introduced in this game. They're actually related to dungeons to traverse too. So the first one being Toad, where you transform into a literal toad. You use that actually to go into a water dungeon later in the game. And then you have the mini status, which turns you really small. You'll do very little damage with like physical attacks, but your magic attacks will still do the same damage. And you use that to travel into like smaller spaces. So Chad, what's your personal history with Final Fantasy III?
Going into this, I knew about the DS remake because I had played the iOS port of the DS remake, and I played through the whole game. I had fun. It was several years ago, so I was a little bit rusty on the story and gameplay, and this was my first time playing the NES version. What about you?
For me, I played the DS remake growing up. I don't really remember too much of my gameplay. I know I beat the game, but like, I don't know, just story-wise, all that didn't stick too much with me, although I do remember enjoying the job system. And then more recently, I played the Pixel remaster last year.
So with that out of the way, Tyler, do you want to talk about your first hour of gameplay and what you did?
Absolutely. So to start, my like lasting impression with this, like for the first hour, was that this was the best game gameplay wise that we've covered so far. It's just so great being able to change jobs at any moment. But it was kind of tedious having to unequip your characters before you change jobs. I mean, it makes sense for the time that they wouldn't there's no like auto equip button, and it would probably be a nightmare for the NES to program how to put all of your equipment into the inventory before you just change your job.
Yeah, so the game is interesting in the way that it drops you off at the beginning into a dungeon. You are immediately dropped off into a dungeon. The only prelude that you get to this is a text scroll on the title screen if you sit there long enough. And essentially you find out that there are 4 orphan boys that are chosen light warriors or something along those lines. Now, I wish I paid attention a little bit more because whenever I was naming my characters at the beginning, I thought they were genderless. So I didn't really think of all 4 of them being boys. And I didn't give them all necessarily boy names. I went with the names Chad, Jack, Cole, and Anne. Don't ask me where I got those names from. They just were the first names that come at the top of my head.
Nice. For me, I named the first one Tyler, and Joe, Hank, and Donald. But yeah, like we have more than 4 characters we could use in this game. But I don't know. I don't know if that's partially because of the fan translation patch.
Yeah, but anyway, the 4 warriors that you're introduced to at the beginning of the game get dropped off in a cave called Altair Cave, or Altar Cave, I guess, because there's no I in that word. And I kind of like this first dungeon because it's a really good tutorial of showing but not telling.
Yes, honestly, the early game itself does a very good job, especially when you go back to town after you leave the dungeon. So, for instance, in town, they teach you about hidden paths intuitively. Like, as soon as you enter the town to your right, you could see an old lady by a well, but she's behind all these trees. And so if you just walk, like, to the right and, like, just start, like, if you wanted to try to go to her, like, you could just start walking through those trees. You talk to the old lady, and she's like, oh, go down the well, and you get some chest, and you get a few potions. And considering potions are, like, 500 gold, or gil, it's well worth it. There's a few other hidden items, like, just on the ground. You press A in the town, and then there's also the, like, shed in the back, and the NPC teaches you about switches, essentially, although the first dungeon also taught you about switches with the rocks.
And you also get your first white magic spell.
Yes, NPCs tell you in the town, hey, if you're going on a journey, you should probably grab the cure spell while you're here from there. So they really hold your hand. Well, it's very linear early game, but they hold your hand, but they guide you, at least.
Yeah. Also, at the end of Altar Cave, you are given the first set of jobs. So right off the bat, not even 30 minutes into the game, you're already given jobs to choose from. And it's a limited amount. It's mostly the jobs from Final Fantasy 1, so most of the returning players would be familiar with these jobs, like Black Mage, White Mage, Fighter, Black Belt, and Red Mage. The interesting thing is there's no Thief job in that first batch of jobs, but
I have a gripe.
Yeah?
Yeah, I have a gripe with how they handled, like, once you get jobs. Like, they don't even tell you, actually, that you got jobs now, like, when you get the first crystal.
Yeah.
And, like, you just have to go into the menu. Like, if you read the manual, you'd be fine, but you just have to go into the menu and, like, manually pick out your jobs.
That is true. I guess I just intuitively knew that you got jobs from the first crystal because of previous games that I've played, like Final Fantasy V, that does a similar thing.
Right, but like the difference with Final Fantasy V is like you get the text box saying like, oh, you unlock the red mage, you unlock the white mage, etc., etc. They did an amazing job balancing the jobs early game. Every job felt useful, at least the ones that I tried, and they felt unique or had a separate purpose. So the team I went with, when I first got jobs, I went with a red mage, a black mage, a white mage, and a warrior.
Interesting combination. I went for warrior, black belt, white mage, black mage.
I was going to go black belt as one of them, but I remembered from my playthrough of the Pixel Remastered that in the upcoming castle, you get a weapon that can only be equipped by the red mage at that point in the game, and they recommend you use that for the dungeon, or the upcoming dungeon.
Yeah.
So I went red mage for that reason.
Okay.
But, like, while you're limited on black magic at that point, there was bows and arrows you could get in the castle, too. And the black mage is the only one that equipped those. So it made the black mage actually very helpful in the first dungeon. Or, not the first dungeon, because you start in the first dungeon, but the second true dungeon. Because there's a lot of undead enemies, and you get holy arrows. In the castle, if you follow through some hidden paths, you can actually find one black magic spell. While no shops sell them early game, there is one hidden one. It's ice. And black mage hits pretty hard with magic then. It's also refreshing that, compared to like Final Fantasy 1, you can actually use spells early game with your black and red mage, or white mage, or even red mage. Like, you actually have a lot of cast before you have to heal up your MP again.
Yeah, they definitely seem to award exploring in Final Fantasy 3, which is something that I didn't do too much. I didn't know about the black magic spell in the castle. So that's pretty cool that they could hide that in there.
Another thing I really like that stood out to me is, at least with, I don't know if it worked for magic spells either, but when you kill an enemy and you had multiple characters targeting that enemy, it'll redirect your attack to a different enemy instead of just wasting that character's turn. Like, it took 3 games to get to that point, but damn, did it feel good to finally be at that point.
Yeah, that only works with physical attacks, not magic attacks. However, would you really be spamming 4 different magic attacks at one time? Maybe, but it's unlikely. Physical attacks are way more likely, and it makes grinding through enemies later in the game much easier. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So after you get out of Altar Cave, you go to the town of Ooze, as we had mentioned before, where you get a small tutorial. And after the town of Ooze, you travel a little bit farther south to Kazus. Now, also, as you mentioned before, Tyler, there's not a lot of different routes you can go. It's pretty much funneling you towards the places that the plot wants you to go to. While I did say that players are rewarded for exploring, that seems to be within the towns and dungeons themselves. Outside, in the overworld, at least in the first hour of the game, very limited. Funnels you right towards the second town, Kazus.
Yes, you could technically skip Kazus and just go straight to Sasus Castle or whatever.
Sassoon.
I was so close.
Yeah.
But yeah, the average player is going to at least take a pit stop at the town, heal up before they would continue heading out anyhow.
But it is important for a story reason to go to Kazus, because you learn that everybody in that town is invisible. And I love the little sprites that they use to show the NPCs being invisible, where it's kind of just a light outline of the character. And somewhat importantly, in that town, you encounter Sid. So Sid is now a mainstay of the Final Fantasy series, making his first appearance in Final Fantasy II, and now his second appearance in 3. You learn from Sid that he has an airship. Who would have thought? You get the airship from him, because he tells you that it's slightly to the west in the desert.
Yeah, it's just so crazy that you get the airship within less than 30 minutes.
You do, but the area you...
Of course, it's limited.
Yeah.
Oh, another thing that stood out to me during the first hour is when you're at shops and like you're looking at equipment, it actually tells you what character is going to equip what piece of equipment based on their current job. That is such another great feature that we take for granted nowadays.
Yeah, they were really making full use of that 512 kilobytes of programming storage in the cartridge.
They also fleshed out towns and made them more lively and made NPCs this is the first Final Fantasy I would say where NPCs were you actually did want to kind of talk to them a little bit. You could see some fun stuff, like in the bar, for instance, there's a girl that'll dance if you talk to her, and you could even interact and play the piano.
But after you get the airship, you travel to Sassoon Castle, as we had mentioned earlier, and you talk with the king and learn that his daughter, Sarah, was captured and has the mithril bracelet, which can heal this invisibility that's infecting the people in the town of Kazus. So you're given the mission to not only rescue the king's daughter, but also to get the mithril bracelet, which will heal the invisibility of these other people, which I kind of like. You know, it's a mission. You have a mission. You have a story reason to go to the next dungeon.
Yeah, and I liked how it was connecting multiple towns together, or the town and the castle.
Yeah.
Like, again, it makes the world feel more alive or connected.
So this is all within the first 30 minutes of the game. And right around the 30-minute mark, I made it to the first dungeon, which is the Cave of the Seal. And this is where you're supposed to go to save Sarah and rescue her. But I noticed that there was a big difficulty spike with the enemies. Maybe because I didn't have the correct equipment on my characters and I didn't have that black magic spell that you pointed out. But I ended up dying pretty shortly after, and I had to reset.
It definitely is a huge difficulty spike, even with being prepared. So I was prepared in several ways. So in Sassoon Castle, the left tower, if you go up there, there's a boss, or like a mini boss fight. And you get a weapon for the red mage that does effective damage to undead enemies, which are 99% of the enemies in the Cave of the Seals. And then also the black magic I had. And then I was using the Cure spell to attack the enemies, because that was doing the most damage, actually. But even then, like, as I got further throughout the cave, I was running out of MP. So I got to right before the Jin boss fight, and I got into an encounter with some Laruai and Curse Coins, and they do way more damage than everything else in the dungeon, and they just like one-shot my Black Mage essentially. But by that point, I was already in too deep. I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna try to see if I fight the boss. I'm close to my hour anyhow. If I lose, I lose.
Yeah, because I had to reset. I basically made it back to the Cave of the Seal, fought a few enemies, and then ran out of time at that point. So you made it all the way to the boss, though.
Yes, so it took me about like 2 extra minutes over the hour to finally kill the boss.
Nice.
But like by then it was like to the wire. Like I had just my warrior left. Everyone else had died. But I think this was an amazing introduction for like the first hour. I mean, even the first dungeon alone is a pretty good intro.
Yeah, of course, I have a sour taste in my mouth since I died, but as I pointed out before, the story's really good for an NES game, but even just for a simple JRPG, I think it's pretty good. You're not given the task to slay God yet.
The music really stood out to me. There's a lot of bangers. I love the boss theme. The regular battle theme I like.
Yeah, Nobuo Uematsu was really cooking at this point in the series. Although I think all of the Final Fantasy music is super iconic.
The trend of early game hit rates in Final Fantasy games continued, of the hit rates being awful. Like, so many fights took like over a minute just because no one would hit, or like half my characters would miss.
So I think that just about wraps up the first hour of gameplay for an average player. Do you want to move on to the things we missed out on, Tyler?
Absolutely.
All right, so there's obviously a lot of the story that we missed out on, but I really want to point out the jobs that you can get later in the game. So we were given the jobs of the Wind Crystal, as I said before, which are the Fighter, Monk, White Mage, Black Mage, and Red Mage. Later on, you go to the other elemental crystals, the Fire, Water, and Earth crystals, where you get a slew of other jobs. I'm not going to go through all of them, but they all have unique attributes to them. And I think they really do all stand out on their own. The issue is the upgraded jobs. So you do get like an upgraded Black Mage, essentially, and an upgraded White Mage, essentially. And they take away from the original class. Now, I know in the DS remake, it was almost beneficial to use the earlier classes because they had more MP for the lower level spells, like just Cure or Poisona or something small. And the higher level mage classes had more higher level magic points, like Cura or Curaja.
The functionality you described also is like that in the Pixel Remastered. Like the lower level tiered spells have higher cast with the lower level classes.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I like all of the jobs. I think they're all pretty cool. A lot of them would make a Return to the Future games, but some of them were unique to Final Fantasy III, like the Scholar or the Viking. This was also the first game that introduced a summoner class. First the Conjurer and then the Summoner, which is something that would become a mainstay in the series afterwards.
There's a few classes I would like to mention that we didn't get to check out. So the Scholar, for instance, has the ability to read enemies' weaknesses. And soon after you get the Scholar, there's a boss fight where the boss's weakness changes every time you hit its weakness. And you can't really do too much physical damage to it, so you pretty much need a Scholar to help you figure out how to damage that boss. There's the Dragoon, which has the jump ability, and there's one enemy towards like the mid-late game, or not an enemy, a boss, where they pretty much recommend you to use a full party of Dragoons, and they even give you, if you explore enough, they give you full sets of equipment for Dragoons for your entire party.
And then at the very end of the game, you get the last two jobs, which are considered the ultimate jobs, the Ninja and the Sage, which effectively function as the ultimate physical class and magic class.
Yeah, the Sage can use black magic, white magic, and summons. And the Ninja has the ability to throw items, and if you get shurikens, you will do insane damage. You'll hit the damage cap a lot of times. But shurikens are very expensive if you even buy them.
But other than that, not to give away any spoilers for future parts of the story, I think we can move on to the final section, our gameplay stats. So within the first hour of the game, Tyler, what was your encounter rate?
It sounds so low to say this, but just 25, which works out to be 0.417 per minute. Like I said, with the hit rate being super low, just a lot of battles took a long time.
And how long was it before you got into the first encounter?
Just a minute and 7 seconds, because your first encounter that's the first time you actually get to touch the controller and play.
So my encounter rate in the first hour was 30, which is pretty nice. Comes out to a nice and even 0.5 enemies per minute. And the time of my first encounter was at 1 minute, 11 seconds. As you said, it's just right at the beginning of the game. You move just a few tiles and you're there. You're in the first battle. Now, interestingly, after the first battle, I leveled up. So it only took me 1 minute and 56 seconds for my first level up.
For me, I didn't level up until, the next battle after the first one, and that was about 2 minutes, 8 seconds in.
It felt good to get a level up so quickly, though.
Yes, especially after coming off of Final Fantasy II, where you don't really level up. I feel like that was almost their intent. They wanted to just point out to the players, hey, it's back. You can level up again.
Yeah, I agree. And throughout all of the exploring you did in the first hour, how many dungeons and how many towns did you visit?
Alright, so for towns, I visited Kazis, and Sassoon Castle. Oh, the castle's not really a town, but essentially. And then for dungeons, just 2, being the Altar Cave and then the Cave of the Seal.
Same here.
And how many times did you have to visit inns?
Yeah, so the game does have inns. However, in the town of Ooze, you're given access to a spring that will fully heal you for free. So I didn't really use inns at all, but I did use the spring to heal my party 8 times.
Okay. For me, I visited the inn 3 times, I say, although one of them in Sassoon Castle, if you go to the top of the right tower, you could sleep in the princess's bed for free. And then that spring you've mentioned, I visited once. You've already mentioned this, but how many times did you die?
So, yeah, I had 1 complete party wipe, and that forced me to restart about halfway into the gameplay, the first hour of gameplay, but I also had 5 characters that were downed throughout the game. I think that Final Fantasy III is a pretty tough game at the beginning, in all honesty.
Yeah, the Cave of the Seal really is just that huge difficulty spike, even with being over-prepared. Or not over-prepared, but being as prepared as possible you could be. Kind of tough. So for me, I didn't have any wipeouts, but I had 3 characters down by the end of the Jin fight. Although I think only 2 of my characters were actually down within the first hour itself. And then what was your final level once the hour was over?
Only level 5, although I see your level wasn't too much higher.
No, I was only level 6, although my fighter did get to level 7 after the boss fight, since he was the only one that got experience.
Ah, yeah. So to wrap this all up, would you pay $1 for this 1 hour experience?
I would. I had a great time overall. I think the NES version holds up pretty well compared to even the Pixel Remaster or the DS version, in all honesty.
With the inclusion of jobs in this game and the fast level ups that you get early on in the game, and also the compelling story, I think this is definitely a $1 steal. I think it's definitely worth $1. I would pay $1 to play the first hour.
So that wraps up our discussion of Final Fantasy III for the Famicom.
Join us next time when we cover Phantasy Star for the Master System.
Goodbye.
See you guys then. You can sleep in the princess's bed.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there's even dialogue where they say, do you want to sleep in the princess's bed?
Wink, wink. Nudge, nudge.
Thank you for watching today and sticking to the end. We hope we gave an accurate representation of the first hour of gameplay, and more importantly, we hope we inspired you to check out the game and give it a chance. If you liked the video, please like, comment, and subscribe for more JRPG content from us. We have a lot of projects in production, so keep an eye out. Let us know what games and series you'd like us to cover in the future. Follow us on Twitter at encounter_rate. If you want to listen to our content in a podcast format, check us out at the places listed on screen. Links will be in description. We plan to upload to additional podcast sites in the future, and if you have any preferred podcast sites you wish we were on, let us know in the comments. Thank you again for watching. Until next time, have a great day.